ideas that I would have presented at a workshop at Stanford on early modern mobility, but which was delayed earlier this year for obvious reasons, and also for work in progress that I've been doing on a focused project on Venice that John mentioned, and also a shorter book on Renaissance mobility more broadly. I was hoping the research that I'm presenting today would be more advanced, but I think for reasons that many people share and would understand, you know, pandemic, small children at home, and crazy teaching term, I haven't got as far with some things as I hoped. So I beg your forgiveness for that in advance. In particular, I wanted to say more, I hope to say more about Venice's empire, but as it is, I'll focus today mostly on the more micro level of the city and its surrounding lagoon, although I very much welcome suggestions and comparisons regarding the empire, and I know that there are definitely some people in the audience who know a lot more than I do about that. So what I want to do with this paper is to start by suggesting why and how we should think about early modern mobility infrastructure before moving on to the particular case study of Venice. So in recent months, the sudden imposition of immobility has made us much more aware of the way in which mobility, its structures, rhythms, and often invisible flows, normally underpins and shapes our lives. But we've also become more aware, I think, of the spaces that are usually animated by movement, the routes and hubs and pathways, as they're all of a sudden left empty. This is actually something I started to reflect on before the virus, about a year ago, standing on the dock of the Lazaretto Nuovo, the former plague hospital and quarantine station, on a lovely November day in the Venetian lagoon with John Henderson. And I'm going to switch to a view of that now, if I can. Oh, hang on. I just have to share my screen. Okay. Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint now? Yeah? Okay. So this was the view more or less that we were looking at. John kindly came to teach my MA students with me about the history of Renaissance plague, but we were locked out of the Lazaretto Nuovo because of a very kind of Venetian misunderstanding. And so we spent about an hour improvising on the dock before we got in. What made me think about these things was that I've spent the last few years researching migration and mobility to and through early modern Venice. The near constant flood of people, artisans, refugees, merchants, diplomats, sailors, soldiers, pilgrims, and many others who arrived in the city to visit or stay. But being at the Lazaretto Nuovo made me think about the moments when most of that movement stopped and the flow of people and goods that were the lifeblood of this mercantile and industrial city largely dried up. The moment I thought about, particularly because it's come up quite a bit in my research, was 1575 to 7, when Venice was paralyzed by the devastating plague population. When the city, which was then at its most densely populated, about 180,000 people, fell eerily silent, about half of it put into lockdown for a period with people quarantined in their homes. And when instead of the constant comings and goings of ships from the Adriatic and ferries from the mainland, the lagoon was almost still, except for the small boats carrying the sick and the dead back and forth to the Lazaretto Vecchio and then Lazaretto Nuovo, the two plague hospitals in the lagoon. For some reason, it's not, here we go, let's try now. Okay, which you could see on this map, hopefully. During this 1570s plague, the Lazaretto Nuovo wasn't silent or empty. It was filled with as many as 10,000 people in quarantine, and another 3,000 were accommodated on a flotilla of small boats moored around the island. But in more normal times, this complex saw smaller but still significant influxes as a centre of quarantine and disinfection for people and goods arriving in Venice from places suspected of plague. It was thus a crucial cog in the system that allowed Venice to both promote and control mobility by helping to protect the city from disease, but also crucially allowing the flow of commerce to continue in all but the worst moments. And there was evidence of this also in the extraordinary graffiti inside, the Lazaretto Nuovo, inside this gigantic shed, which is where the merchandise used to be brought to be fumigated and purified. And if you go inside, if anyone's visited it, there's this extraordinary graffiti which records the presence of people and merchandise that passed through from all over the Adriatic and the Mediterranean in the early modern period. Also the workers, the lowly bastazzi or porters who moved the stuff around. And they recorded their names also, and a lot of them were also migrants, interestingly, from the Venetian terraferma towards the mountains north of Venice. So I start this talk at the Lazaretto Nuovo as a space occupied by different types of movement, both in more ordinary times and during a moment of crisis, such as the 1570s plague, as a way to suggest why it's important to think about infrastructures of early modern mobility and why Venice is a particularly rich case study. From the perspective of such a place, which is too often forgotten, I think, and not visited enough, although it can be hard to get in, and the contrast between the paralysis of the plague years and the controlled movement of other times, we can understand something about why mobility mattered and how it worked at this time for the Venetian state, for the people living there, and for those who arrived or passed through. It's now, I think, fairly well accepted that the early modern period was marked by increasing mobility. And by this, I mean more people moving over longer distances more rapidly and more often, although for a huge variety of reasons. The era was also marked, not incidentally, by increasing control and surveillance of mobility, with the institution, for example, of precursors of modern forms of documentary identification. And I'll give an example or two of that later on. However, only quite recently have early modern historians begun to engage more explicitly with a mobilities approach that is something which is now quite well established in the social sciences. And I've been reading, for example, Lisbeth Coren's wonderful book on confessional mobility in the last weeks. So this is an approach which places movement of all kinds at the centre of scholarly inquiry and aims to unpick its various cultural meanings. It encourages us to see mobility rather than stasis as the norm for human societies. But it also draws our attention to the spaces and structures that underlay and enabled mobility that might actually entail stillness or waiting as much as movement. And for the early modern period, we might be talking about quarantine sites, but also about inns, checkpoints, boats, coaches, post stations, and the others, compared to the kind of sites that contemporary mobility scholars examine, such as airports, car interiors, trains, highways, etc. The crucial thing about these infrastructures of mobility, again, to borrow a term which has been favoured by recent sociological and geographical writing, is that they didn't just facilitate or accelerate different kinds of movement, but they also channeled, controlled, and sometimes blocked them, helping to sort out who was allowed to move more or freely. As is expressed by this quote from a recent work on this topic. So I should note also that I'm defining infrastructure quite broadly to include not just spaces and buildings, but also organizational systems and material culture that went along with it. For example, identification documents, which were issued by the authorities to individual people so that they could move. And I should also say that I'm, as recent literature suggests, we should, and also for the early modern period, we must, I think, thinking about this not just as a top-down, state-run question of building massive structures, but also as spaces and systems which numerous ordinary people had a stake in creating and managing. Customs officers, boatmen, coach drivers, innkeepers, postmasters. I'm going to talk about a few of them. So there are a few things I think are useful about focusing on infrastructure. One is that there we go. One is that it can provide some insight into movements which might at first glance appear to leave few historical traces. Very few early modern travellers or migrants left personal accounts of their journeys, for example, travel diaries, but very many of them passed through these kinds of spaces or engaged with these systems. So they can potentially offer insights into more common, less elite experiences of migration or travel. Secondly, they draw our attention to the marks that mobility left on both urban and rural spaces, many of which have not received the attention they deserve, as well as the kinds of buildings that I mentioned before, also gates, walls, roads, quays, bridges. And this is something that I'm focusing on in the special issue of the Journal of Early Modern History, which is coming out next year, which is co-edited on Cities in Motion, which is about looking at the impact of mobility on early modern urban spaces. Another thing that I think this approach does is to, if we focus also on the ordinary agents of mobility, if you like, innkeepers, boatmen, etc., it reveals their often crucial roles in creating and maintaining these infrastructures, and thus again in shaping the journeys and arrivals of people on the move, acting as mediators between migrants, travellers, locals, and authorities higher up the chain. This can give us insight not just into people on the move, but also into more settled communities and their interactions with foreigners, and not just in big cosmopolitan cities, but also in more rural areas of transit. So illuminating this interplay between mobility and settlement. But I also want to stress here how different systems of infrastructure are intertwined, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes impeding each other, and so need to be looked at together. So what follows, I want to give a few examples of this in relation to the infrastructure of hospitality in particular, and how this interacted with those other infrastructures such as transport, communication, and disease control. So why Venice? I hope I don't have to work too hard to convince this audience why Venice and its empire are a crucially important case study for the history of early modern mobility. Quite simply, this was one of the most mobile cities and regions in early modern Europe, and it made its fortune from its position as a hinge of trade and transit. Sorry, it's a bit hard to change slides. The Venetian Empire came into being in part as a way to facilitate the passage of commodities and the people that carried and traded them to and from Venice. This meant that promoting but also controlling mobility within and beyond the empire were crucial matters of state, and perhaps at no time more so than in the 16th century, which is the focus of my research, because of a confluence of factors: economic, political, demographic, religious, environmental. Thus, early modern Venice shares many similarities with a place like the Suez Canal region, which was studied by Valeska Huber for the late 19th and early 20th century, simultaneously a hub, a boundary area, and a choke point where we can see the global enmeshed in the local, in Huber's words, and where the differentiation, regulation, and bureaucratization of different kinds of movement could take place. Because of the intensity of mobility to and through Venice, it tended to be a pioneer, or at least an early adopter, of new and often very influential approaches to this problem. So, for example, in the establishment of the lazaretti that I mentioned before as permanent sites for quarantine and treatment from the 15th century, which has been studied by my friend Jane Crawshaw-Stevens. Also in the use of health passes or fedi di sanità, which you can see one here, which are of course passes which are issued to people to allow them to travel, showing that they came from a place that wasn't infected with plague, and which Venice is one of the first places to start to print, drawing on the strength also of its printing industry from the 16th century. At the same time, historians, not least Filippo Di Vico's wonderful article on walking, have highlighted how the particular environment of this amphibious city gave special social, political, and cultural resonances to smaller quotidian micromobilities moving around the city on foot or on boats. So if we focus in on the level of the city and its surrounding area, we can see how a huge range of different types of movement pass through and coalesce there. And we can understand more about this, particularly by looking at how longer range infrastructures and networks that supported or shaped these movements overlapped and intersected there. For the last couple of years, as I said, I've been studying particularly how people arrived in early modern Venice and where they stayed when they got there. So I want to talk about this issue of hospitality for a few minutes. while key spaces for segregating and surveying foreigners more or less strictly, such as the Jewish ghetto and the Tedeschi and Turki, the warehouses, trading houses for German and Muslim merchants, these have been well studied. What I've tried to do is to illuminate a broader and less familiar infrastructure of commercial hospitality, which ranged from the 20 or so centrally located inns or osteria to a much more pervasive, mostly shadow economy of lodging in private houses known as albergaria. These various structures typify some of the different facets of infrastructure that I highlighted. The osteria, for example, were clearly very important. They're not mandated institutions in a sense, but state mandated, but they were clearly very important to the state. They enabled the reception of a range of beneficial kinds of mobile people, such as diplomats, merchants, nobles, pilgrims, but also artisans, artists, actors. I found evidence of them staying in Venice's osteria. They were the sources of generous rents for their patrician and ecclesiastical owners, and key spaces for the collection of a lucrative wine tax. And because of this, they had to be located in these very central areas near San Marco and Rialto, as you can see on this map, so that they could be kind of overseen closely. And this is evident also in this mid-16th century print of Piazza San Marco, which shows the last surviving osteria opposite the Ducal Palace. There had been a row of them there where the Biblioteca Marciana now is. This is the last one that survived. They were moved in the course of the 16th century to the back streets around the piazza, but this gives you a sense of how kind of close to the centers of power they were, so they could be watched. The inns also act as a kind of funnel for many kinds of migrants and visitors passing through the city. A point where people could be monitored and surveyed to check that they didn't pose a threat to the community, whether that be political, religious, economic, perhaps conducting clandestine transactions, or in a health sense by bringing disease. Because of this, innkeepers played a crucial role. And again, we're actually often talking here about migrants. Innkeepers often came from the Holy Roman Empire or from the Venetian terra firma, particularly around Bergamo. And they had a role not just in ensuring comfortable accommodation was provided, but also played a role in surveillance. They were charged with reporting daily on the comings and goings of their guests. So we can imagine an innkeeper looking somewhat like this guy on the left, overseeing his customers. At the same time, we can study these spaces to recover something of the traveller's point of view, which suggests how inns also served a range of other important ends. For example, as spaces of entertainment, perhaps while people were waiting to move on somewhere else, as locations for meetings with other travellers and with locals. And as this image and quote, this is a Roman osteria, but nonetheless, and this quote from a late 16th century Venetian work, which describes innkeepers briefly, suggests also how, as I showed with the graffiti at the Lazaretto Nuovo, people who passed through these places also left their mark on them, even if we can't recover them now, and actively engaged with them. So this is about the guests, the foreigners in the inns, writing kind of reviews on the wall about the innkeepers and their failings. So that's to say something about the inns. The lodging houses also give us some sense of how the interests of the state, ordinary Venetian residents and people arriving or moving through intersected in various ways. Lodging houses also were very important to the local economy as well as to social and cultural life, albeit in a less visible way. From the 16th century, the Venetian authorities increasingly tried to license these lodging houses so that they could tax and monitor them, but it was very difficult to do because they were so often sort of hard to identify, basically. So this is a map with about 200 different lodging houses that I've been able to identify in a period of 2 years when the records actually survive, because actually they don't for most of this period. But this, from various other indications, this was probably just the tip of the iceberg, really. I mean, you can already see they're much more spread out than the inns, but at the same time, we have to imagine a much wider economy, kind of shadow economy of lodging in private houses. Surviving evidence shows that many of these houses were run by women, often widows, artisans, often more or less recent migrants themselves, who supplemented or made their entire income by renting out a few rooms or beds to new arrivals. And this is just to give you a flavour of the kinds of records, the kind of people who get lodging licenses in this 2-year period. It gives you a sense of the range of kinds of people who are hosting foreigners in their houses, but also of the different kinds of mobilities that these foreigners represent. Political, religious, commercial, academic, students, you know, artisanal, a great range. So again, like the inns, the authorities also tried to use lodging houses as privilege points to monitor foreign arrivals in the city, to profit from them, and to try to ensure that they didn't spread disease or disorder. So for example, lodging housekeepers also were repeatedly prohibited from providing accommodation to vagabonds and beggars, or those who couldn't produce a valid health pass, or from crowding too many people into one room and thus promoting contagion. Because of the kind of clandestine nature of a lot of this lodging activity, it's very difficult to study in detail, but the sources that I have been able to put together suggest that this largely subterranean sector played a crucial role in providing accommodation, both for shorter term visitors, perhaps merchants or artisans who came to trade or work for a few weeks or months, but also for migrants settling in for longer periods. As a result, I've argued that these kind of spaces offer really interesting perspectives on the experiences, both of people on the move and of local residents with whom they interacted. And I published some of this material in an article in Urban History a year or two ago, where I suggested that these were spaces also of cultural, religious, and even culinary encounters and exchanges, two-way encounters, because both between the different people that live there, but also between the residents and the owners or the housekeepers. Although they weren't official communication sites like postal stations, lodging houses like inns seem to have acted as vital informal information exchanges, valuable sources of knowledge about how to negotiate Venetian society and bureaucracy, about onward journeys or news from home, about job prospects and business opportunities. So they were very important, I think, both for new arrivals trying to find a foothold in the city and for ordinary Venetians trying to get by. Even though here we're talking about an infrastructural system that was largely informal and over which the state struggled to maintain oversight. We can see some of the same dynamics at play when we look at how the infrastructures of hospitality also interacted with transport networks. For example, the system of ferries or traghetti, which brought people in from various points around the lagoon, and which was again closely overseen by the Venetian government. These ferries connected into longer range transport systems across the Adriatic or up the river. Thanks. Transport systems that went up to the cities of the terra firma, up the rivers and canals, and they disgorged their passengers, as you can see hopefully from this map, very close to some of the sites of the accommodation providers that I mentioned, particularly the Osteria around Rialto and San Marco. And that's evident also in this map, which shows the inns and the ferry stations together. And I should note too that the boatmen or barcaruoli, like innkeepers and lodging housekeepers, just to say something briefly, this is again to show the proximity of these different systems. This is the Riva del Vin at Rialto, the banks of the Grand Canal right near the Rialto Bridge in an early 16th century print, which shows two inns with blue arrows at the top, the Gambero and the Studione, in proximity to exactly where these kind of ferry stations were, to again give you a sense of how these networks connected with each other. Oops. Okay, so the boatmen also were meant to play a role in blocking and monitoring the movement of less desirable arrivals, as well as just bringing people in. So they're instructed, for example, only to carry people who could display their health passes. At times they were also instructed to forcibly deport unwanted groups like foreign beggars and prostitutes. And yet again, both government records and other sources about these spaces of transport and their operators can also shine a light into the experience of being on the move in this period, and how these could also be sites of encounter and exchange, entertainment and pleasure. So for example, a case from the 1550s, which I found, talks about people playing cards on the boats into Venice and various unscrupulous characters faking accents and clothing and duping the foreigners who were coming in. So that gives us a sense of the kind of activities that might have taken place on these boats. Another example, more sort of positive one, is the boat from Venice to Padova, which went up the Brenta Canal on a daily basis, and which was described by various people, but among them by the traveller Fynes Morrison, as a place of pleasant discourse where different kinds of passengers, monks, students, courtesans, interacted with each other. So with these last examples, I'm also starting to zoom out a bit from the city itself and suggest how the extension and replication of some of the same mobility infrastructures spread out from the capital. I want to conclude by giving a few quick examples of this, further examples, although I should stress that this is where I have a lot more work to do. And I'm drawing also on the research of other people, including some fantastic younger scholars, looking at aspects of mobility in other localities within and near Venice. If we just look at the wider space of the Venetian lagoon, we can immediately see how the city was surrounded by a ring of natural and man-made structures which enabled but also filtered and blocked movement from all directions. I mentioned the Lazzaretti already, but the Castelli, or these sort of checkpoints, which you can see the ones on the Lido on the right-hand side, but there were others, were places where watchmen inspected incoming passengers and their documents, especially when plague was around, but also small inns on the edges of the lagoon, which were stopping off points, for example, where you might change from horse transport to a boat for the final leg of the journey. The French writer Montaigne stopped at one of them at Lizza Fusina, which is marked here on the left, on his way into Venice in 1580. And this is just another map which shows Lizza Fusina, so it's a bit fuzzy, at the mouth of the Brenta Canal coming down to Venice. Lizza Fusina was also the site of a kind of ingenious mechanism called the carro, which transferred boats from the Brenta Canal to the lagoon. This was patented by a French inventor in the 1440s who'd been lured there by the Venetian government, and it was managed by a branch of the aristocratic Pesaro family, who made around 1,000 ducats a year from collecting tolls and running the adjacent osteria. And this is something that my colleague Luca Mola has worked on. So further out still, other cities in the empire played important roles in channeling mobilities towards Venice. On the terraferma, there were very close links with nearby towns like Mestre, Treviso and Padova, and I've marked two of them on the map here. So for example, in February 1514, the Venetian diarist Sanudo recorded that the Hungarian orator had just arrived in Treviso. He wanted to come to Venice the next day, so he left his horses at the osteria in Treviso, and he was planning to go back straight away after that. So we get the sense of this kind of constant coming and going between the mainland and these close by cities. And there are lots of other examples of people leaving their horses in Treviso or Mestre and coming back to pick them up on the way back. And Philip Bronstein's recent book on the Germans in Venice has a wonderful opening chapter which describes some of the infrastructure of transport and hospitality for Northern Europeans moving down through the Alpine passes into Venetian territory. And I've marked the two most important passes on this map. I'm sitting about an hour and a half from the Brenner Pass right now. And this shows also how various mechanisms such as prohibiting passage on certain roads and the inspection of custom tickets at border checkpoints work to funnel trade towards and through the lagoon city. These examples suggest how the Venetian state, like other early modern states, increasingly tried to extend their infrastructures to both promote and channel mobility in this period, but also how the development of systems to make moving faster and more comfortable for some went hand in hand with attempts to impede the movement of others who were seen to pose risks. And we could also look in this light at the efforts to establish lazaretti across the mainland and maritime state between the 15th and the 17th centuries, efforts which, as in the case of the Lazaretto Nuovo, could be just as much about facilitating commercial and other traffic safely as about preventing or treating disease. And this is just showing some of the cities in the Stato da Mar where Lazaretti were established in this period. And yet Venice, again, like other early modern states, had neither the will nor the capacity to micromanage every movement across its borders or through its territories. The government was content to delegate a good deal of control to local authorities and or low-level agents. And this is something that Luca Zenobi writes about in his recent work about the border between the Milanese and the Venetian states. And they also worked on directing flows, as I've said, towards designated choke points, not least the capital itself, that could be monitored more closely. Looking further at how Venice managed its mobility infrastructures in this period could certainly tell us a lot, I think, about the centrality of mobility and migration in early modern state action and state formation, confirming how even in the early modern period, mobility makes states, in the words of a recent work of this title. But I won't say more about that because I think it's something that probably Luca has more to say about and has written wonderful things about. What I'm personally more interested in doing, and I'm finishing up here, is rather than just putting mobility back into the history of the state, is to reconfigure that history to incorporate more about the experiences and actions and perspectives of ordinary people, both the more settled and the more mobile. I've tried to show some of the ways in which we might think about how these infrastructures shaped mobile people's experiences in key ways, facilitating blocking, but also providing spaces to gain information or entertainment, how they provided points and spaces where numerous more or less mobile people met and interacted, and also spaces in which ordinary actors played important roles, and I've mentioned particularly in lodging, housekeepers and boatmen. I've tried to unearth some of these underlying webs and substructures and draw attention to some of these apparently peripheral places that allowed both the capital city and the wider state to remain hubs of movement, interaction and exchange. But this also, I think, allows us to see how mobility and immobility or settlement or rootedness interacted with each other and were inextricable from each other. And I think in our own historical moment, it's evident again why we cannot understand one of these without thinking about the other. Thank you.
Rosa, thank you very, very much indeed. We should all, it's a shame we're not all present so we can't clap, but I think people seem to be clapping anyway. It was a wonderful paper, thank you very much indeed, in which you've covered so many themes and raised so many questions. Which will no doubt be discussed further in the discussion as well. And you even brought in plague and the Lazzaretto, and I remember well our visit to the Lazzaretto Nuovo and the strange experience of giving a lecture on the just outside rather than inside. It was very enjoyable indeed. We now pass to Luca Scholz, and in fact, some of the themes that Rosa raised will also, I'm sure, be addressed by Luca, and in particular how the themes which mentioned by Rosa in infrastructures of mobility in relation to how they channeled, controlled and checked people, and that's very central to what Luca is going to be talking about. Luca is lecturer in digital humanities at the University of Manchester. The author of Borders and Freedom of Movement in the Holy Roman Empire, so related very closely to some of the themes discussed by Rosa. He also, he combines, he's very broad ranging, and we have a lot to learn from his expertise because he has an expertise in both European and digital history. and particularly involved in the relationship of political authority and human mobility, and more broadly, the interactions with and perceptions of the atmosphere and the use of geospatial and computational methods to study the past. I said we would be learning a lot from him. His recent publications, apart from his book, which again reflect the width of his interests, Deceptive Contiguity, the Polygon in Spatial History, and Mapping Aerospace on the Visual Imagination of the Atmosphere. So we look forward to hearing about the atmosphere of early modern Europe in relation to mobility, and your title is Old Regimes of Movement, Borders and Passports in the Holy Roman Empire, which I much look forward to listening. Luca.
Thanks a lot, John, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here tonight. So yeah, the Atmosphere project, that's the new one. So I won't talk too much about that one tonight. But what I will talk about is the Holy Roman Empire, which is arguably a quite different context than the one that Rosa just talked about. But I think it does resonate well with what we've heard, especially about how mobility and immobility are things that we should think together, right? And how those belong together. I'll try to share my my slides. Let's see. All right, so you should now be able to see it. Perfect. Okay. So my talk is divided in two parts. I'll talk a little bit about the history of safe conduct and passports in the Holy Roman Empire, and what that tells us about how the inhabitants of the Holy Roman Empire negotiated their right to move. And then I'll ask whether the notion of borders is a useful concept for understanding the relationship between political authority and human mobility in the early modern German lands. And then in a conclusion, I'll take, in a sense, a more broader stance. And as John had already mentioned, so this is, if you would like to read about these themes in more details, it's basically all in my book that came out earlier this year. All right, so let's get started. Governing the movements of goods and people was a common problem throughout the early modern world, from the Venetian Empire that we just heard to the English poor laws, if you like. But arguably, there are few places where it posed a greater problem than in the Holy Roman Empire, where you had more than 300 would-be sovereign political entities, of which some, to use the words of an 18th century lawyer, consisted of nothing but borders. Now, what I want to do is approach the politics of mobility from the lens of safe conduct, in German Geleit, which was one of the Holy Roman Empire's most important frameworks for negotiating the movements of goods and people and their restriction. Again, safe conduct was a widespread institution that could be found across the pre-modern world, but it took on an extraordinary significance in this incredibly fragmented landscape that was the Holy Roman Empire. And it could take on many different forms. So originally it was a practice of physically escorting certain travelers and vulnerable groups of travelers to protect them. So these could be merchants or messengers or envoys or Jewish travelers or these categories of people. But it was also a practice that was used to honor traveling people of rank, for instance, traveling princes. But it was also, in a sense, a framework for levying tolls and customs duties from commoners and from people transporting goods. Now, in the act of escorting, a prince could express their control of a road or a river and the boundaries of their dominion. So this was something that was important for all imperial estates, but it was especially important for those that were at the bottom of the feudal pecking orders and whose claim to territorial superiority were particularly precarious. So let me give you one example, which is from the Duchy of Wertheim. It's a small stretch of the River Main, so I'll zoom in. I'll zoom in here. So we're looking at a small stretch of the River Main through the very small county of Löwenstein-Wertheim. It was a minuscule political entity that was surrounded by two fairly powerful neighbors. On the one hand, the Prince-Bishopric of Mainz, and on the other side, the Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg. And it fell victims to the whims of those neighbors, had a devastating feud with Würzburg in the early 17th centuries. And one of the key points of contention was the safe conduct for the market ships to and from the Frankfurt trade fairs. So the red stretch on this map that you can see here, that was the stretch where the Counts of Wertheim claimed their right of safe conduct. They claimed the right to escort ships from the riverbanks. And it was disputed on both ends by its respective neighbors. And there are some sumptuous historical maps from those that were recorded in lawsuits around those disputes. So twice a year, you had competing safe conduct processions that competed over the right to escort market ships from the riverbank. So if we zoom in, you can actually see those. You can see that. So the way this would work, so you can see the ships that are returning in this case from the Frankfurt trade fairs. They're being towed upstream on the river, and you can see the armed escorts escorting the ships from the riverbanks. So the counts and their neighbors would mobilize hundreds, sometimes thousands of subjects. They would assemble them in the early hours of the morning at the boundary stones, which you can also see here with the coats of arms. And then they would attempt to escort the market ships. And the aim was basically to keep the vanguard of that procession. So what you would have is shoving matches, and often much worse. Now, many subjects, but even officials, were not always keen on taking part in those processions, partly because they could get seriously out of hand. So you had often, well, always threats. You had insults, mockeries were very common. People would drink on these opportunities, which didn't help. But you could get a warlike scene. So people occasionally died in those occasions. In 1602, for example, the Count's market ship fell into an ambush. So suddenly they heard a bell ringing, and there was heavy fire from both sides of the rivers. 2 subjects died on that occasion. One subject, a certain Hans Friedel, received a shot through his foot with a poisoned bullet, they claimed. And the report says he died enraged and frenzied several days later when the poison afflicted him terribly and brought him to madness. Now, as a consequence, commoners often refused to participate in these processions. They complained or they hid away. But on other occasions, they were more outspoken. So on one occasion in a report, there's a mention of a certain baker, Stefan from Wertheim, who grumbled that he was, and I'm quoting the report, that he was so tired of beating the drums that he almost could not move his arms anymore, and that he would prefer to say goodbye to my drum and return it to the town hall. Or you had the fishermen of a village, Faulenbach, who almost staged a rebellion and insulted the Count's officials with foul words and chased them out of the village. But travelers themselves were also often annoyed at this practice, and they refused to be escorted. Most importantly, the emperors repeatedly asked not to be escorted in several situations, and that was partly to avoid conflict and the nuisance that came with it. But there was also political meaning to that, because by claiming exemption from safe conduct, they asserted their authority over the territories that were passing through. So safe conduct, as you have seen, I think, from these examples, was a way to dispute, was a way to express, to reject, or to negotiate completing claims of what you could call sovereignty. At the time, you would have called it territorial superiority, Landeshoheit. But which is a fairly general statement, and I think it's important to in a sense make that a little more precise, because I think it materializes a very specific aspect of that kind of political power, and that is the authority to restrict, to promote, to channel, and to fiscally exploit the movements of goods and people, which, as you can imagine, was hardly attainable in this complex geography. But I think it's important to see the disorder of these safe conduct processions, not simply as a sign of laxity and of incompetence, which it could be, but also as a symbolic expression of the deep controversy involved in the old Reich's politics of mobility. Now, what did all this look like in everyday life? Obviously, commoners were rarely escorted. They experienced safe conduct as the levy of tolls and customs duties and an obligation to carry letters of passage. But this was no less problematic. And to understand that, let me give you another example. And let's take a look at what happens at ground level. And in this case, in Thuringia, which you're seeing a map here, which is one of the most fragmented regions of the early modern empire. So you had at some point you had more than 30 pretty distinct political entities on a very small area that corresponds to roughly what Swaziland is today. And it was also traversed by strategic trade routes from north to south and from east to west. It was dominated by one noble family, the Ernestine Dukes of Saxony. They claimed the right of safe conduct, not only in their own territories, but also in those of their neighbors. And essentially, if those susceptible of paying conduct duties were obliged to carry either a conduct ticket, which was basically a receipt for having paid the duties, or a passport, which documented their exemption from those duties. But you had to have either the conduct ticket or the passport. Now, what the dukes attempted to do was to monopolize the issuance of passports. They would only recognize their own throughout the region. And that entailed a symbolic subjection, a bureaucratic burden, but also long delays. And I found a report from 1689 that, in a sense, encapsulates reveals that potential for conflict. And the situation was the following. So there was a ducal conduct official who encounters a wagoner who is carrying wood on account of a neighboring count, and he had neither a passport nor a conduct ticket. So the official unhitched the horse of the wagoner and sends him for the person who paid him to carry that wood. And he had to wait several hours on the roadside. And after several hours, one of the count's valets arrives. One hand on the holster, according to the report, drunk. And what's interesting about the report is that it is in the form of a dialogue. So what I'll do is I'll just read you the beginning of this dialogue, because I think it really conveys how these encounters played out. So the valet arrives, hand on the holster, and talks to the conduct official, and he says, "Why do you arrest the things of my lord? Lightning should strike you." Conduct official replies, "I do not arrest them. I want to see the passport." The valet replies, what passport? He had no passport. Why did he need a passport? Was he not enough of a passport? The official replies, although he is enough of a passport, he should have come for a free ticket. Why did he need a free ticket? If I wanted to see the free ticket, he had it in his arse. He would show me arseholes. And he uncovered his behind and said, here it is. Now, this goes on for 4 pages. There's significantly more name calling, and I will spare you the rest of it. But I think that the valet's rage illustrates quite nicely how the obligation to carry a passport could be perceived as an exceedingly bothersome and even debasing request, and that the right to move was something that was fundamentally negotiated, and that the formal structures that were charged with channeling movement were often inhabited by individuals who tended to operate on the basis of complex webs of personal obligation and of strategic self-interest. And in a sense, we should be quite wary of adopting overly hierarchical perspectives on the history of movement in early modernity. Now, and I won't give you more examples, because there is no well, it would exceed the time, and I want to go to the second part. I want to talk about border, but I think what's important to note is that the flows of goods and people in this landscape often shaped the state more than the state could shape these flows itself. So authorities in the Holy Roman Empire found it very difficult to channel movement, and often adapted to changing patterns of mobility by moving their toll stations, creating new ones, or competing with each other and lowering duties. And I think this ties in very well and very nicely also with what Rosa mentioned before, and also the Mobility Makes States book, which I think is a fascinating contribution to these debates. And I think that these kinds of conflicts around the ordering of movement in the Holy Roman Empire invite us to rethink, or allow us maybe to rethink, the relationship between human mobility and political authority more broadly. And I want to do that specifically by looking at the way that we as historians talk about borders. Let me go to the second part of the presentation. Now, in contemporary discourse, the border has pretty much become a shorthand for all state interference with interpolity mobility. Let's take a current, or a relatively current example, right? So the so-called refugee crisis in Europe has often been framed as a question of protecting borders. It was something, the notion of borders was very prominent in these kinds of discussions. But in practice, and a map like the one that you're seeing here suggests that in practice, the practice of policing undocumented migration and mobility is something that takes place mostly at internal ports of entry, so at train stations, at airports, at places where people work, at places where people live, and in detention camps, which are often far removed from the actual borders. Now, what I would argue is that we as historians tend to use the word border in a similar way, as a shorthand for contact between authorities and mobile populations. And certainly that's what I did when I began working on this project. And I think for me, but maybe also for others, one reason why that is tempting to do is that the maps that we draw and the maps that we use emphasize, reinforce this emphasis on the border. At least for me, many of the ideas and sometimes also misconceptions I had about early modern territoriality came from the maps that I was using. Let me give you an example again. This time from the Eastern Alps around 1600. So what you're looking here is actually this is a corner of Venice. You have Salzberg here. You have Carinthia, which would be there. You have a piece of Bavaria here, and so this is just to exemplify this, right? This is a fairly conventional map that is structured by polygons, a map that is structured by these neatly drawn boundaries. Now, if you imagine someone moving through that landscape, it's easy to imagine that they would be controlled at the territorial borders. Now, if we add to that if we map these boundaries against the toll station, so the places where people would be stopped, maybe interrogated, maybe searched, and often would have to pay something, you can immediately see that there's very little spatial correlation between these boundaries and the toll stations. And once you take into account the terrain, you see that the toll stations were located along the main corridors with the lowest elevation, which again, if we take into account the road network, makes sense because obviously the toll stations were located along the major and strategic trade routes. But I think what this example shows is that maps of state interference with trade flows look quite different than maps of jurisdictional boundaries. And it is not until, in the case of the Holy Roman Empire at least, it's not until the second half of the 18th century that this geography of governed mobility undergoes a more profound transformation, where the levy of duties was increasingly relocated to the outer borders and often also the major commercial hubs within a territory, and where duties were also increasingly seen as a tool of protectionism and economic policy, in addition to just generating fiscal revenues. And there is, let me show you another example, which is Bavaria, which is in a sense a textbook example for this process. So in 1764, the Electorate of Bavaria reformed its toll system. It abolished all internal tariffs and drastically cut 400 toll stations across its territory. To a situation that you can see here. So as you can see here, there's still some internal custom stations, but you only would have to pay duties at those when your journey involved a border crossing. And if we take away the border, what's very nicely visible is this capillary network of secondary toll stations along the electorates, along the territory's outer boundaries, along the perimeter, that reveals this new concern for controlling traffic along its outer perimeter. So I think, in a sense, what I tried, or what I'm interested in, is finding more creative, maybe more complicated ways of mapping pre-modern societies, because I think they can make a big difference. And I think in this context, one of the key challenges is to find ways of mapping space that overcome conceptions of spatial order that are primarily concerned with spatial differentiation. So where space is seen as a flat representational plane that can be visibly partitioned, as a flat surface on which these states project their dominance, a vision of space that maybe found its culmination in the thought of thinkers like Carl Schmitt. And it doesn't help that the shapes formed by territorial boundaries are the symbols of the nation state par excellence. If you think of the hexagon in France, or Italy's Italy's boot shape. But I think the examples that I've showed just now is that space was much less clearly partitioned in a reality like the Holy Roman Empire. And I think it would be interesting to find alternative, and there are exciting projects underway that are actually working on that, right? Of finding alternative ways of mapping that are in a sense more representative of these pre-modern complexities. And that's also because maps are a problematic tool, because we tend to trust maps much more than we would trust, I don't know, a table, right? Than we would trust statistics, which are, well, equally flawed. So in a sense, maps can be a powerful corrective to the geographic conceptions that we rely on, often implicitly. And in a sense, that is much of what my more recent work is about, of finding meaning and criticizing ways of finding meaning in historical data by mapping it and by visualizing this. All right, so let me conclude. Okay. So again, if I should, I'm sorry if I shamelessly advertise my own book here. If any of this resonates with anyone's interest, I would encourage you to just have a look at my new book, because most of those points come up there as well. So I think to conclude, I think it's common to describe and to understand the early modern period as a period of enclosure. The classic examples like property right, but also well, increasingly successful attempts at monopolizing various societal tasks by emerging states. And in a sense, the idea that what political scientists still call the Westphalian system inaugurated a political order that was predicated upon the autonomy of sovereign states and non-intervention in domestic affairs is part of that tradition of envisioning this period. Now, in practice, and in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, these polities were ill-equipped for the role that political theory had thrust upon them. The constitutional order of the Holy Roman Empire and the Westphalian treaties even guaranteed extensive rights of transit, of trade, and of migration. So the early modern period in this case was in many ways a time of transition in which the governance of movement at the state level remained punctual and, to use a very postmodern term, rhizomatic rather than aerial. And the old Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, looks like a closed reality if one looks at its cities, as Yair Minsker has done. But compared to the modern border regime, its territories were very much open. And I think what's important is that questioning this notion of closable borders should not mean to stumble from one extreme to another, because it's tempting to frame early modern history as a history of migration and mobility in opposition to immobile conceptions of old regime societies. And today, there are many advocates of a mobile, of a connected, or obviously a global early modernity, that I think it's safe to say that this myth of pre-modern immobility, if it ever really existed, can be considered as shattered. But maybe the pendulum threatens to swing too far when everything early modern seems to have been in flux. And when those who highlight elements of friction and of stasis are easily portrayed as dupes of anti-feudal sentiment. Ultimately, I think these diagnoses of modern or early modern spatial orders vary with the scales of analysis. In many cases, the functions of territorial borders were filled by city walls. And late modernity has witnessed other forms of spatial segregation, from the ghetto to the reservation. So I think early modern politics of mobility in the Holy Roman Empire, but I think as we've seen from Rosa's talk as well, combined fluidity and friction and yielded widely different results for different social, corporative, religious, or economic groups at different times. Some roads were closed only at specific times. A landscape could look very different during a trade fair, during an epidemic, or during a war. Letters of passage had to be acquired by some travelers, but not by others. Traveling persons of rank had to deal with often bothersome symbolic practices and formalities, where a peasant could move without bother. And whereas vagrants were forced into clandestinity, carters could move quite freely as long as they paid the required dues. Boundaries could be powerful barriers for safe conduct processions, but they rarely pose an obstacle for everyday travel or commerce. So in a sense, it's a unsatisfyingly complicated story. There was also in the Holy Roman Empire a long intellectual tradition of free movement. Would be tempting to idealize that. In practice, this tradition could be connected to projects of hegemonic rule and violent conquest. So I guess what this does maybe is that it invites, the case of the Holy Roman Empire maybe invites us as historians to separate the problems of statehood and border control. But it also suggests that spatial considerations ultimately only tell a part of the story. A borderless landscape can be replete with gated communities. And in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, I think the language of borders ultimately, and I think that is my last point, is ultimately a poor resource for understanding the politics of mobility. Border talk, with its emphasis on dichotomies like open and closed or inside and outside, obscures the fact that the politics of mobility are characterized by the interplay of obstructive and accelerating factors that affect different forms of movement in different ways. So I think in that sense, this history points beyond our late modern infatuation with the border and shows that the ways in which societies channel mobility has often been simultaneously promotive and restrictive, socially exclusionary, highly contingent and situational, spatially dispersed, and always morally ambiguous. And that's it.
Luca, thank you. And again, we should clap. Luca, thank you for a splendid paper, which was extremely stimulating and interesting that, I mean, obviously, because you're dealing with a related paper, related subject to Rosa, you have themes in common, and particularly I like this juxtaposition of the fluidity and friction of movement and the right to move being fundamentally negotiated, but the difficulty, on the other hand, of channeling movement. And I very much liked the wider methodological issues that you raised, the complicating ideas about what was a border, what is a border, what constitutes a border, the spatial order or the political and commercial borders. So thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure both yours and also Rosa's papers, which are complementary and raise different points, will raise many, many questions. And I know how many people there are in the room, so I'm not going to hog the questions at this point, but Lisbeth Correns, who is my co-organizer, coordinator of the session, is going to organize the answering of questions. And I think, Lisbeth, you're going to encourage people to write comments and questions, aren't you?
I just put it in the chat, so we sort of keep it fairly open. If you want to write your question and prefer not to come on screen, then do just write it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll shout in between. If you want to raise your hand, I don't know how used everyone is to Zoom. You can if you click at the bottom of this screen on the participants logo, there you can, if you click on that, then you find the function of raise your hand, and we'll keep an eye on that if you want to ask a question, or you can drop it in the chat as well if you've got anything to ask. And there is a long question coming already, so I'll try to read that out. Rosa, do read along, but we'll try to get that on audio as well. So, like, more about getting to the end of that in the kind of plebeian mobility's particular moral contagion, in the kind of the more morality questions around these as well.
Shall I try?
Do you want to address that question?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I kind of wish you'd said that in person, because I think it'd be easier to take in. Yes, I mean, as I alluded to, there's quite a lot about attempting to prevent, particularly at times of famine and food shortages for obvious reasons, trying to prevent poor foreigners from coming in and or kick them out. And it is difficult, as you say, because it's kind of a poorer city. But on the other hand, working with other historians of early modern, even walled cities, you know, they come up with wonderful examples of lots of ways you can get in even to a walled city. So I'm not sure in the end how different Venice was in that way. But, you know, as I've said, there are these sort of points stationed around where in theory they're meant to check. Innkeepers. Yeah, particularly the lodging house keepers, again, get targeted because I think they tend to be the ones who are lodging the poorer migrants. And there are these kind of sort of almost zone of kind of almost flop houses to the west of Piazza San Marco, which is constantly targeted for lodging lots of poor people and also being as sites of plague spreading and various things. So there tends to be quite a lot of focus on the lodging house keepers, but the innkeepers as well. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Dave.
There is a question for both of you from Angela about how you scale your research and your arguments, because you've got Venice and you've got the Holy Roman Empire. They're fairly different in scale. And so the question very much is like, what is not there? People not moving outside of the net you've cast. So maybe Luca wants to start with that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean that's a difficult question, I guess. Well, I think it's something that all historians, but especially maybe pre-modern historians have to deal with. I guess the way I approach this is I went to over 20 archives overall, and I found sources everywhere, and then I really focused in on basically every chapter is focused around a particular landscape. But obviously, yeah, there is a lot. I think one danger that there is when working with this is that it's easy to write this as a history of conflict, because that is what the archive will suggest, because that is what produces sources. If someone passes a checkpoint or a control and there isn't a conflict, there won't be a paper trail in most cases. So I think ultimately there isn't much in terms of balancing out that data that you can do other than resisting that temptation, which I try to do, I think, to ignore the fact that probably in the majority of cases, movement did not. There was not much friction.
Should I say something quickly? Just in relation to that. Yeah, no, I mean, as I've sort of tried to show in the paper, I sort of started at the level of the city and was trying to sort of map and study these different spaces of movement within the city. And as you probably got a sense from the paper, I'm in the process of sort of starting to zoom out and think about how those kind of patterns map onto the wider empire, if you like. But I'm not I hope to be further advanced with that. I'm certainly not nearly as far advanced with Luca, who's been working on these kind of issues for a lot longer than I have. But I think I was quite inspired by examples like this, the book that I cited about the Suez Canal region as a way of thinking about, as it said, the sort of global in the local context. So I think in the end, I mean, the kind of movements I'm interested in, again, are very hard to quantify and possible to quantify, obviously. So I think kind of as similar to Luca, focusing in on these points where you can kind of see these tensions playing out is the way that I'm approaching it at the moment. Thanks.
Super. Actually, following up on the point that Luca was making, Kat Hill has a question for Luca about that kind of it's conflict that you see. And so her question is very much like, if you could say something about your focus away from borders as such and qualifying that, if that shifts away narratives from migration as a story of control and of immigration and of closing borders, and complicates that and how we see the movement of and migration.
Yeah, I think absolutely. So I think in a sense, I think that this kind of narrative can, I think that is, I think also that was in a sense my own trajectory. So I started out, I want to write a book about borders, and that's what I started out with, and I ended up not finding any, or at least they weren't where I expected them. So in a sense, I turned it into a virtue and wrote a book about borders where maybe not that. important. And I think it's not, and that wasn't just a matter of convenience. I think there's actually a real story there. And I think, yes, in a sense, historians who overemphasize borders buy in a political discourse, I guess, that you can agree or not agree with, but that certainly emphasizes a view of migration as something abnormal, and as something that in a sense is the exception rather than the norm. And what I found was not an easy story, was a complicated story. There's not much to romanticize there, but certainly the people moving across boundaries was not the aberration, was not perceived as an aberration. So for instance, I have a whole chapter on lawyers discussing, framing all those questions and treating those, and sometimes taking quite a broad view of discussing also, and almost getting into political philosophy about those questions. And there you find sweeping formulations of and defenses of freedom of movement. Many lawyers arguing that rights of transit and rights of movement, in a sense, precede the formation of states, and therefore states can never limit those, which obviously were controversial ideas at the time. But I think that in a sense, I guess it can correct a vision that is maybe often focused very much on the 19th century and on the 20th century, and actually show that if you take a look, if you go a bit further back in time, there's actually quite a robust tradition where freedom was the norm, and borders were, at least in relation to mobility, were actually maybe not that important.
Thanks for that. And Alex, I've seen your hand, but I think Hannah Murphy's question actually ties into that, about like the conflict and violence, and just the kind of, she notes this is the same time period that a lot of bureaucracy starts exploding, and so wonders how reconnecting borders and spaces might also help us think about paperwork and bureaucracy, or if it reinforces the narratives about codification and the violence of the archive, and follows up just like the checkpoints, points and passages seem to depend on paperwork quite a lot. And that's where lots of the law gets actually applied. So whether you wanted to say anything on that as well in relation to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess it's not the perspective that I took on this, but yeah, I think there's definitely something there. And I think there is I think there's definitely a story there. Though in a sense, again, what I find is that a lot of this is negotiated on the ground. So there is certainly in the political centers and the centers of power, decisions are being made. But in the end, the people who, in the day-to-day setting, decide how this is enacted are private individuals, and they sit in a much more complicated landscape than maybe the central bureaucracies that send them, I don't know, pre-printed passports to give out. And I have a whole chapter about these agents. I call them agents of enclosure, who do all kinds of things because they have to. They're often in a very, very difficult position. Sometimes they can be very powerful. Sometimes they can be completely powerless. But in a sense, so yeah, I think that is what comes to mind regarding this question of bureaucracy. Again, I guess the answer is it's complicated.
Rosa, do you want to say anything on that? Because you do wonderful work with passports as well.
I was thinking actually about one of the other questions about prostitutes. So my mind is full of that at the moment. But I'll let you direct the discussion if you want to go to that question or another one. So
Alex Bamji, you had your hand up for a while already. Do you want to say?
Thanks. I had a question for Rosa. Thanks for a wonderful paper, really enjoyed it. I wondered if you could say a bit more about the temporality of mobility in terms of what you found so far. And this is following on a bit about the question around the mobility of the poor. Because one of the interesting sort of juxtapositions in your research is between those inns and those lodging houses. And do you get a sense of how long people are spending in these places, but also whether perhaps in some cases people are moving backwards and forwards between the city and especially the terra firma countryside, often for quite extended periods of time? We get a sense of that a bit in other sources, but do you feel these people are tied into these infrastructures of hospitality, or if there's a kind of another level to be adding in here?
Oh, thanks, Alex. It's lovely to see you. yeah, I mean, a few things come to mind. Yeah, I mean, firstly, the inns seem to be a bit more short term, although not always. I mean, you find people even, I think, staying in them for months at a time. And often they stay in them for a few days and then move out into lodging. So it's sort of, that seems to be where you go. But certainly there are, and you know, the more I'm trying to widen out this research beyond Venice, the more I'm aware, and I was sort of trying to allude to this, of this kind of coming and going from different places, as you say. Whether to the, or for example, you find people sometimes passing through Venice. I found a case of some pilgrims going to the Holy Land who stay in a lodging house on the way out, and then they stay again in the way back, and, you know, and vice versa. So yeah, you can sort of track some of those flows going in and out of the city, but that's again one of the reasons I sort of want to broaden this out, to think about how we can follow some of those paths to other places throughout the empire and beyond, really. I hope that answers the question.
A question I got separately from Sam Kennelly is tied into that, how the Venetian methods of reception and organizing mobility compare to those in other Italian cities, such as Rome, for instance. I guess this is a very different, because you mentioned this is they escalate quite quickly in lots of the work on this.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about Rome in particular. So, I mean, in some ways, Venice has heaps in common with a lot of other Italian cities, and they're often the first one, you know, cities like, even smaller cities like Siena, or what else has been studied? Bologna, other cities, the things like having inns, you know, submit their lists. So, I mean, also in other parts of Europe. So I find again and again, there's always that tendency to say, I think Venice is the first to do something, but actually they weren't. And Rome is, I mean, even more a city of, well, maybe, I think, you know, as much a city of mobility as Venice, but different kinds of mobility, obviously. So there's been, so there's very similar structures. I mean, there's some work which shows that there are these kind of inns, but also particularly in moments of influx, like during a papal jubilee, you know, half the city becomes impromptu lodging housekeepers to sort of host all of the pilgrims coming in. So I'd say there's a lot in common. It's, you know, I don't want to single out from that Venice at that point, but Venice also has these wonderful sources which allow us to sort of follow those things in some detail.
Super. I only just caught the prostitute question. Do you want to say anything? So about these inns as exchanges of information and culture, and what the role of prostitutes are?
Yeah, just briefly, because that's what I was trying to think of an answer for when Luca was talking about paperwork, which is something else that I am fascinated by. Yeah, I mean, but prostitutes actually feature a lot, as I would say, along these kind of almost mobility workers. I mean, they're explicitly described by the government as, you know, we need brothels. This is a port city where they're performing an essential service. They're definitely present in the inns. And they, but at the same time, there's a lot of overlap again with this broader network of lodging houses that prostitutes sometimes run, take lodgers. There's a lot of concern about this because, you know, the government doesn't like that happening too much. And there's a case from an Inquisition trial that I talk about in that article that I mentioned about the lodging houses, where the lodging house keeper is a woman who's accused of having sexual relationships with the Turkish and Greek merchants staying in her house, and she probably was a kind of prostitute of some kind. So I think they are absolutely key. They're also very often migrants themselves, again, sex workers in Venice, as in many other places. So again, really fascinating and crucial kind of mediators between people coming in and out, I would say.
Super. There's a question from Lorenza, if you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Thank you to Rosa and Luca for your wonderful papers. I really enjoyed them. I have a very, very brief question for Rosa. Rosa, I'm particularly interested in the recruitment of foreigners who joined the Venetian fleet. Especially in the late 16th century, quite a considerable number of people left from Naples to join the Venetian army or the Venetian fleet. And then once they arrived in Venice, they will then go on the galleys traveling along the Adriatic Sea and down to the Aegean Sea. And I'm particularly interested in the Venetian community in Candia. So what my question is, what type of infrastructure did the city of Venice offer to accommodate these groups of foreigners before they would leave and join the Venetian fleet? And also, in what areas of the cities were they stationed before they would leave to travel around the Venetian Empire? Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. That's a great question, and I wish I knew more to tell you. I've been trying to find out more about sailors and soldiers, also because migration historians like Leo Lucassen talk about this need to, these are some of the biggest categories of mobile people in the early modern period, this kind of what I think they call institutional mobility, and yet they don't. I haven't studied them very much because they kind of don't fall so much within this commercial hospitality focus that I've had about Venice. I have found some references to soldiers and sailors being billeted. Well, for example, the higher up kind of what's the word? Higher up people in the hierarchies of the fleets and things being billeted in particular lodging houses, for example. As for all of this, I don't know. Maybe someone in the audience knows more about this, but it's definitely something I want to find. They seem to have been treated as a somewhat separate category from other kinds of migrants that the Venetian government was trying to keep an eye on in different ways, but it's definitely something I need to know more about. So thank you for bringing that.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Thank you.
I was actually curious about that for Luca as well, because like Venice is this watery place, the Holy Roman Empire isn't, and how much do the rivers and do some maritime borders play in your story?
Yeah, I have one chapter that is about the Lower Weser, which is that it's the last stretch of that river that connects Bremen to the North Sea. So it's basically its economic lifeline, and you have disputes. You have profound disputes about that, and I think in many ways it's similar. I think you could argue, and I think the French historian Daniel Roche wrote about how rivers can actually sometimes be more violent, because basically if you have a conflict around a road, you can always there's always loads of other roads that you could take. With a river, you don't really, well, there aren't many alternatives, and certainly not with the Lower Weser. And I think that turned some of those conflict, that particular conflict escalated almost in a war, and eventually also with an imperial ban on the entire city of Bremen. That was only that was how that ended. So I guess that is what I mean, overall it's a fairly landlocked story, but and there's also it's also interesting the difference between land and rivers in the legal discourse. Again, I won't go into that, but I think there is maybe even going back again to Carl Schmitt, there is this idea that the legal history of land and sea is profoundly different. And what I found is all these lawyers desperately trying to take all the fancy arguments from the battle of the book, so either be it Selden, be it Grotius, and apply that, often a bit desperately, didn't always work out very well, to the situation of the roads and rivers in the Holy Roman Empire. And so clearly for them, land and sea those were not distinct legal universes. To the contrary, like they drew massively on their literature.
Super. There's a question from David Gentelcourt to you both about how much the pandemic and all the measures that have been put in place to regulate travel movements and not moving, but also like the carrying of papers to justify your personal movement, lots more very explicit border checks. How much has that impacted your sense of the past and the kind of questions that you're asking of the past at the moment?
Rosa, do you want to go first?
Well, I was going to say you go first, because I think I said something about that already a bit at the beginning of my talk. I mean, I've been working on migration and mobility for the last few years, but it was just as literally this moment standing at the Lazaretto Nuovo of really thinking about actually how when things stop is a moment where you suddenly get this sort of different perspective on that movement. So it's something I was already wanting to think about more. And then, yeah, I mean, obviously, particularly being in Italy through the first lockdown. I mean, all of these, the politics of movement, also I mean, lots of things in the current environment also made it, I think, politics in general and Brexit and Trump and all of these things make us think about these dynamics between, migration and senses of identity to do with people who are settled and all of these kind of things. So it's something I'm thinking about a lot, but yeah, definitely it's made that very much more acute. Luca, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I think, I mean, so the book came out in February this year. And I think the pandemic came here. Well, that was about the time when it came here. So there wasn't, I think it didn't really influence the book a lot. I think for me, it was more the kind of discourse that we had the years before, and maybe particularly in the US, it was particularly this trope that Trump's wall had become, right? This stupid symbol, in a sense, that in its simplicity, which kind of but it's also very seductive in a sense, at least for it works very well as a political symbol. And in a sense, I think that maybe brought me to think a bit more, in a sense, to reflect a bit more why that kind of image is so appealing. And I think part of the answer is that it suggests these simple, clear-cut divisions and suggests an idea of mobility that is very simple and does not really have much to do with how mobility, even illegal or undocumented migration, actually happens.
Could I ask a sort of supplementary question to that? I mean, we've all, over the last 6 months or so, been aware of the regulations, and some people have obeyed the regulations, some people haven't. And I was wondering, Rosa, in relation to Venice and your infrastructures of mobility, how far you're able to trace conflict and resentment of and reactions against the imposition of regulations and the sort of restriction of movement in and out of Venice. I mean, not just during epidemic periods, but more generally.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. No, there's quite a lot. I mean, there's heaps. It's quite like the wonderful examples that Luca gives from his work as well, of, for example, from the 16th century, they bring in this thing in Venice that you're meant to arrive and get a kind of permit to stay called a bollettino. And there's heaps of examples in the surviving records about people who didn't get it or who were already there for 8 months, when they're caught without a bollettino, or for innkeepers who aren't reporting their guests, or for even the low-level functionaries who are meant to be collecting the lists or checking that people are obeying, who are actually just drinking and eating in the inns. So there's, constant, I mean, at the same time, it's also what Luca was saying about, you can see the gaps in the system and the impossibility of really monitoring all of these things. It's a kind of ambition to try and say they're going to monitor everything coming in and out, but it's clearly not, it's not realizable in this period. And I had another example there in mind, but it's just slipped my mind. But yeah, no, I mean, it's everywhere, really, that kind of pushback against those kind of, no, I know the example I was thinking of. It's also, I mean, again, it kind of depends on different social levels of traveller, because I think it's again Fines Morrison who talks about, in theory in Venice, when you arrive, you're meant to get this bollettino, but in fact, you just go to the office and you tell them that you're staying a week or so, and then they don't bother you anymore. So there's a kind of sense that if you're at a certain, social level, you could maybe get away with certain things. But, there are ways to get around all of that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Thank you. Alison, you need to unmute.
Hang on, I can unmute you. Normally. No, I can't.
Alison, would you like to type your question, perhaps? No.
No, you're still muted.
Just press it once.
Now you can speak.
Can I talk?
Yes.
My question becomes less and less relevant the longer this goes on. But probably, it's a question for both of you, but perhaps especially for Luca, because you talked about passports. And so it started me thinking about safe conducts in Florence, which is my area of study. And when I looked at them, they were only applying really they were only needed for people in war. And there's one instance when they say that the English don't need safe conducts because we're in peace and friendship with you. But the merchants still wanted them, and so they were given them. And so my question really is this the case that safe conducts are needed only for enemies of the state? Or is this rather a peculiar example?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So it is the case for certain safe conducts, and I think that is what is distinctive about how safe conduct became a very broad framework in the Holy Roman Empire. So you had cases where you had political safe conduct. So for enemies, you had safe conduct for prisoners, for instance, when prisoners had to be transported through a territory. But even when a non-enemy political agent traversed the territory, and that could be sensitive, then they needed to ask for safe conduct, and it was perceived as very problematic if they didn't. But then you had a much broader, you had other forms of safe conduct. You had the one that were essentially what in other regions we would refer to as customs duties or tolls. But that was still considered as a matter of safe conduct in the Holy Roman Empire. Or you had those processions that in a sense were their own form of safe conduct. So I think, I guess to answer the question, so you had those forms in the Holy Roman Empire, but it was a much broader conceptual universe in a sense, and applied also to commoners in that sense. If that answers the question.
Thank you.
I would have a question there for both of you. I really appreciate your avoidance of chronology. So I'm not being ironic here in the sense that you have you're attempting to counter certain narratives that are quite linear, of modernization, of the creation of the state, of the creation of the territorial state, and its sort of symbolically consolidated borders and all of that. And that's great, I guess. You want to get away from that and complexify the question. Is there any sense that you might give us a little, if you went back to thinking about chronology, whether there is any significant change in these practices over the period that you've studied? So let's say, from mid-16th to mid-18th century. And would that change then fall back into something quite close to those traditional narratives? Or is there something else to take away from this?
That's great. So I'll try and say something, although I think Luca will have a much better answer to this because I think he's thought more about these kind of big questions from that perspective. But yeah, I mean, I think there certainly are changes in the early modern period, and maybe it's also about pushing some of those changes back from that are typically associated with modernity towards the early modern period. It's something I've been trying to think about for a book that I'm editing also with Paul Nellis about the mechanics of early modern mobility. But it's certainly, for me, it's this period when a lot of these systems that we now think about as sort of regulating and channeling mobility are brought into place in a big way in Europe. And it's one of the reasons I think Venice is a fascinating example, because it pioneers a lot of those systems, as I was trying to say, to do with documentation, to do with the bureaucratization that we talk about, of recording, all of these kinds of, trying to record all of these kind of movements, for example. And even, I was struck, coming back a bit to David Gentlecorey's question about what this moment kind of, how it illuminates this thing, how many of the the regulations to do with governing movement are elaborated in the period after the Black Death in particular, to do with control of disease. It's one of the major kind of motivators for bringing in a lot of these kind of regulations and attempts to control and flow mobility. So I think that, you know, I'm not sure, that doesn't really answer your question, but that's some of the ways that I've been starting to think about it.
Yeah, so so I think there is maybe one chronological observation that I made that I think is fairly consistent and is telling, even though it's very drawn out. So if the last maps that I had shown, where I talk about that in a sense that where increasingly the border is being used in the way that maybe we are used to seeing that today. So you find actually this effort at having controls along the perimeter and actually control and abolishing at the same time customs stations and toll stations in the interior of the territories. That is something that I increasingly observe in the second half of the 18th century. So Bavaria is a very good example for that. It's very drawn out in other cases, and so in some cases, and I think that kind of transition only happens in the 1840s in the case of in parts and in northern parts of what was then, well, in the successor states of the Holy Roman Empire. But I think that is definitely, there's some major changes going on in the second, I would say following the mid 18th century.
Are there any more questions popping up? In that case, I think I'd like to thank our two speakers enormously for very, very stimulating papers which have addressed lots of new questions and sort of leading us to new methodologies. Lisbeth, you've got your hand up.
No, sorry, I was just clapping.
It looks enormous. It's probably clapping. So we should all clap and thank you very much. And thank you, the audience, who've been absolutely splendid and come in enormous numbers and asked, again, stimulating questions. Thank you very much indeed.